Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing very well.
Good.
And I want to start off today with talking a little bit about an article in the national interest. It caught our attention because we're talking about the Afghan war, and that's a historic war. I don't know if you've heard or not, but it's been a long war.
Been a while, yeah.
And you date it by when your child was born or something like that.
Exactly.
You know. But anyway, everybody knows it's been going on a long time, but it's not in the news very often, and people aren't caring that much. Someday they will when they find out what it's costing. But the title of the article was "America's War in Afghanistan is Now About Only One Thing, Pride." I think pride is pretty important when it comes to foreign policy. I wouldn't agree that that's the only one thing, because there's a lot of reasons for this. But I came across this issue of pride and vain that was expressed in foreign policy, that they argued with me in the debates that you can't walk out now. You can't quit, because that means all our effort, all our money, and the men that died all died in vain. And my answer was, we're allowing more to die and spend more money, bring them back. So pride is something that is an interesting term. I think it drives people in the wrong direction sometimes, but it's a shame that if you don't need to destroy the whole issue of pride, because I think we're allowed to be proud. I happen to be proud of my family, and Americans should be proud too of the country that we were supposed to be. And so it's more than that. I think it's close to vanity is what they're talking about. And in this pride, we can't lose a war. And I remember Johnson, in the 60s, we cannot lose the war. I do not want to be the president who lost the first war. And they stayed, and so we elected Nixon, and 34,000 more people died. You talk about vanity and not wanting to give up and just sticking to it because you can't accept the truth. And of course, there's maybe a lot going on with this in Afghanistan, but there are motivating factors on the people who justify us even going in there for commercial reasons and other things like that. So this is a driving force, and it's very important, and we wanted to address that.
Yeah, and it's rather an esoteric topic, perhaps, but the word pride in the headline really caught our attention. And pride, in these days of self-esteem propaganda, pride has a different meaning, a different connotation. Of course, according to the Bible, it's one of the 7 deadly sins. And as you point out, it's not the pride in your family or pride in your country, but it's the traditional meaning of pride, and that's why we have things such as pride goeth before the fall, an excess of pride, an excess of these things. And so I think it was a great piece, and Gerald Labor is a gentleman who wrote it. And he points out a couple of things about foreign policy experts. Trump said, hey, I talked to all my experts. All the experts, everyone in Washington, every expert, they all say, we can't get out of Afghanistan. They'll come fighting us in the streets of America. And here's a good quote from Labor in the piece about the real problem with our foreign policy. He said, intervention begets more intervention. Washington cannot rely on the very people who gave America the war in the first place to provide an honest appraisal of their own efforts. That is the problem.
Yeah, that's it. And unless those attitudes are changed, nothing's going to happen. We'll be there for another 10 years, but I think something will happen before that. There was more hope in the early part of this administration and the campaign, certainly in the early months, but I think there's less for us to be expecting something good to come of this, and this will end. So it's going to continue. The spending is going to continue. And although it's never in the news, we still do lose men over there. And it's a serious problem because it institutionalizes a system of maintenance of an empire. We're not fighting a war. We're just maintaining our interests. And we have to keep the troops there to keep order because we own this country now. And that is the big problem. This also came at a time when we came across something about Pompeo, I think it was a tweet that he put out, which is really pretty interesting. You know, he was tweeting that he was criticizing, I think, Russia because Russia was doing too much. They were sending bombers to Venezuela. And he accused these two countries of just wasting all this money and not taking care of their poor people. So that's a bit of a stretch. But so he obviously didn't want the attention drawn to maybe we waste money once in a while, and maybe we have a growing middle class and a poor class, and the middle class getting poorer exists for part of this reason too.
And it seems like every time Pompeo opens his mouth, he puts his foot right in it, because you can't read the tweet without laughing. Here's a guy who's working for the administration, working for a military, national security state that has bases in 170 countries across the globe, has military troops. And here's what he said. So the Russians sent over a couple of their Tupolev bombers as a joint military exercise with the Venezuelans, whatever. We do that all the time. Here's what he said. Russia's government sent bombers halfway around the world to Venezuela. The Russian and Venezuelan people should see this for what it is: two corrupt governments squandering public funds and squelching liberty and freedom while their people suffer. Well, what does that say to us with the Russians with a $60 billion military budget and the U.S. now with a, what, 700 and some billion, probably more than $1 trillion? Well,
was it Putin who had a comment to make about this?
It was his spokesman.
Yeah, his spokesman about the amount of money we spend.
Yeah, he said half of your defense budget, you could take care of all the welfare of Africa, all the poor people in Africa. So.
Yeah, a point that will be missed by our administration and this country, but an important point, obviously. You know, on one program, we emphasized the fact that we were encouraging and complimenting our president for saying, well, instead of 770, we only want $700 billion. And that was good because the year before, Trump got more money than he asked for because he figured the Congress would take care of it. But for some reason, there's all this trouble in the world, and Trump has boosted back up. He's back up to $770 billion. So it doesn't look like the military-industrial complex will be going out of business. I think profits are going to remain good. And unfortunately, the American people will pay for it. For me, the frustrating thing is the disconnect between what we spend, what we do, and who really pays the bills and what the cost is. Because the cost is not direct taxation. We can't tax the people in the lower 30% income. They don't have any money, you know. So what we do is we inflate and we regulate, and people eventually pay and build up the debt. And the inflation really hurts the people they claim they're trying to help. So this is just back to regular business, and I'm sure this final budget will be bipartisan that they're working on right now.
And this is, you know, goes with our title of it, the arrogance, foreign policy arrogance undermines national security. Here's President Trump in a lucid moment saying, gosh, $716 billion military budget? That's just crazy. We can't afford this. And then less than a week later, he says, well, we better ramp it up another 50 or so billion, which is the entire budget of Russians, our great adversary. You know, it just goes to show what is the arrogance of spending that much money on something, you know, the U.S. that has no real threats.
Yeah, but every once in a while, they're caught at it, and they have to admit the truth because there was a so-called audit of the Pentagon, and they found out there was an error made, and they didn't realize it was an accounting error, and we were giving all the fuel to the Saudis to fly their flights into Yemen, and they didn't have to pay for it. I guess they didn't have enough oil to pay it. But anyway, we did that, and they you know, obviously thought this was a big deal, but they called it an accounting error. But it is an error. But the error is in the foreign policy. The error is the sneakiness on how they hide the black budget, you know, the dark budget. They're doing this, and but the overall running error is what we talk about here almost every time we have a program. You know, that is the error in the thinking of an interventionist foreign policy. Those are the errors. So even if you catch this, we finally found them, we're going to say, and even this isn't going to save any money because they stopped doing this a month ago, but they'll get it to them somewhere else. So it's this is tinkering around the edges, and they're going to hide it and sneak it and do it all. So unless policies are addressed and they're out in the open, and the American people say enough is enough, we want this change, we're sick and tired of it, and they will. When we're flat out broke and we're facing a much more significant crisis than we have today.
Yeah, and you talk about how, even what the word is for it, but the U.S., is caught footing the bill for fueling Saudi jets as they bomb primarily Yemeni civilians. You talk about insult to injury. We go back to Pompeo. You want to talk about squandering public funds and squelching liberty and freedom? How about being part of Saudi Arabia's horrific, disgusting, dirty war in Yemen? That's the reality, and that's why, again, Pompeo, foot in the mouth Pompeo, always saying the opposite of what's true.
Yes, and there's going to be a major change in Joint Chiefs of Staff because Dunsford is term limited, and so to speak, his term's running out. So we got a peek at who the proposed new general will be, and I think we have a little clip on Milley, the General Milley.
Video
if we
clip.
could put that up.
Just give you a little
because Milley is not soft-spoken, and he I don't know what, I imagine he carries a big stick, but it looks to me like he has a big voice too.
Those who try to oppose the United States, I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm.
Are you ready to come back?
I want to be clear to those around the world who want to destroy our way of life and that of our allies and friends. The United States military, despite all our challenges, despite our op-tempo, despite everything we've been doing, will stop you, and we will beat you harder than you've ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that. Other countries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, went to school on us. They closely watched how we fought in '91 and '03.
Yeah, here he is. The U.S. Army will beat you harder than you've ever been beaten before. That's probably true. They can blow a lot of stuff up. We've seen in Raqqa, we've seen in Iraq, we've seen elsewhere. That's probably true in one way. But really, at the end of the day, what have we achieved 17 years in Afghanistan? We beat them pretty hard. We beat the country up pretty hard. What have we achieved?
And what did we achieve in Vietnam? We were a little bit arrogant and filled with pride about how powerful we were. It reminds me of that little conversation that two colonels had, one Vietnamese and one American, Colonel Summers with Colonel Tu, and they were working out the peace arrangement. And our colonel, Colonel Summers, couldn't leave it alone because they are powerful and we are, and he had to maintain this image. And he looked at the General Tu, and he says, you never beat us once on the military field. Mm-hmm. And Tu came across, responded with an astoundingly shrewd answer. He says, that is true, yet it's irrelevant. And so all this thing going on, so I guess we haven't lost too many battles in the Middle East, military battles, but it's also irrelevant because we're losing all the peace. We've undermined the system, and the peace is lost, and we're in there for a long, long time. And it has a lot to do with this whole idea. We go to war for various excuses, oil and military-industrial complex, all these things, but ultimately, the military in particular, the American people in particular, the American people don't want to lose a war, so they buy into this. And this came up, in a debate about, why would I not support the troops? Support the troops meant more money and more troops and send more in. And I said, why? Yes, we have to admit there's a point of no return. Maybe somebody has died in vain, but the most important thing is that we point it out, and we should just come home. And they really didn't like that. And the American people generally superficially, they'll say, yeah, that's true. We're not quitters. We're fighters. We always win. But we didn't win in Vietnam. We didn't really win in Korea. The attitude was different during World War II. But we're back at this point that we can't lose the intention. We have expended so much life and limb and money to go into Afghanistan and these other places, and nobody wants to walk away. One is, pride and arrogance, but the other is, of course, the commercial interest too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just close. Actually, I did have a quote. I was going to use it earlier, but if our friend back there can find it and put it up, because we're talking about arrogance, this idea that we can remake the world, and also that the whole entire rest of the world wants to be exactly like us, and we can help them do that with a few guns and bombs. This goes back to the national interest piece that we started with, and the author is quoting Chris Coyne and Rachel Mathers, who wrote a piece recently, and he says, these experts, the experts we talked about earlier, Dr. Paul, believe they can, quote, design a plan that, if implemented properly, will yield an outcome preferable to the status quo. And success is merely a technological matter directly dependent on the amount of effort and resources invested, as well as the execution of the plan. So therefore, it's never a good time to leave. You always got to do more money. You always have to send in more, because it's never asked, and he continues, if the U.S. is able to get it right in the first place, if we should be doing it. So, Dr. Paul, that's the issue of arrogance we tried to address a little bit today.
It makes my point about them dealing with it as a technical and a tactical procedure. We just need better managers. Welfarism and the welfare state all will work better if we have better managers. And he's just arguing the case that we need to change that. He does nothing about suggesting why are we involved and how do we get in this mess and how are we going to finance it and who's really paying the bills for this. No, they totally ignore this. But the whole issue of pride is important, and we've talked about that. But once it drifts over into a government thing and a national thing and a justification of war, we're talking about something else. We're talking about outright arrogance, and nations that become empires have to be arrogant because they have to be, self-serving. They have to believe they are really great and powerful, or they couldn't run the world. And of course, we shouldn't have anybody that thinks they're powerful enough or smart enough to run the world. We shouldn't even have a government that thinks they're smart enough to tell the people how to live and how they want to run their lives or how to run the economy. So what it does, it leads to an arrogant attitude that engulfs the whole nation, engulfs the people, engulfs our government. And it's very inviting because militarism is always popular. So there's an attraction to military might. We are strong and you can't touch us. And, certainly during the Cold War, this was very tempting. This will make us safe. So military might is very tempting, but having it 10 or 20 or 50 times more powerful than you need to defend the country, that is totally unnecessary, and it's the arrogance that's driving it rather than good common sense. The same thing happens in financial might. Once you become very powerful in the richest country in the world and you have a reserve currency, people will borrow from us and we have great wealth as a reward. We can forget about, the payday that might come and will come and is starting to present itself. Yes, that financial might comes to an end too, but people love it because, believe it or not, there are a lot of benefits from it. Although we are tempted, our government is tempted to blame the Chinese and all the other bad people around the world, and never our own policy, and never the way we spend money, and never because of the mismanagement of the reserve currency. But then there's another might that we have to contend with, and that is a morality right, that we're morally correct and morally superior. And this is probably what aggravates the world's other people more than anything, because that's when we throw our weight around and we start lecturing people and we say that we are the exceptional nation. Not only are we good and we should spread our goodness, we have a moral obligation to do it. It isn't like we're bad people who like this policy. No, there's a lot of people that feel that we not only are superior, we have an absolute obligation to spread it. You know, I happen to think and have so much respect for the principles of liberty. I have a personal obligation I put on myself that if I believe in these things so strongly and I believe they're the right thing to do, I should try to promote them in a non-aggressive manner, not by force of bombs and not the use of government, but through an intellectual pursuit of telling the people why the world would be better off if they followed a policy of non-interventionism in our personal lives, in our economic lives, and certainly in our foreign policy. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.